Because Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick, Conservative MP, has joined us in the studio. Very good afternoon to you.
Hello, good afternoon, Julia.
Wow, have we got a lot to talk about. Now, I was going to start with you, first of all, talking about these early prison releases. However, stories that have come in to date since we arranged for you to come on the show, particularly relating to the Prime Minister, who's been over in Albania, meeting with the Albanian president there, where he's been talking with him about what we can do to tackle illegal migration. And, of course, you're a former Home Office Minister, and indeed you resigned from office over failures which you thought the government wasn't going to get to grips with, even with the Rwanda plan to actually tackle illegal migration. Well, the Prime Minister has announced that the government is going to begin exploring the possibility of sending failed asylum seekers for processing in third countries prior to deportations. Although the Albanian president said, no, it won't be in Albania. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it shows that Keir Starmer's claim to smash the gangs and stop the boats is a total mirage. He has no plan. In fact, everything's getting worse, isn't it? This year is on track to be the worst ever year for small boat arrivals. I don't know about you, but I listened to Keir Starmer's speech in Downing Street.
You managed to do
the
that.
Other day.
Well done.
It felt like it was a hostage situation. He'd been wheeled out by Morgan McSweeney and his advisors to read out a speech he obviously didn't believe. This is a man who has built his entire career on being open borders, who has opposed every piece of legislation to control our borders, who said border controls were racist, who signed letters trying to prevent the deportation of foreign criminals back home to their own countries. And now he's claiming to be someone who's going to get tough. It's obviously not working. This was a totally performative stunt in going to Albania, and he's been rebuffed by Edi Rama, the Albanian leader.
But he cancelled the Rwanda policy, which was exactly, presumably, it sounds like, exactly what he's talking about doing now.
Well, no, I think what he's proposing is that a very small number of failed asylum seekers get sent to some mythical country, and obviously no country appears to want to play ball with him, whereby they stay there for some period of time and maybe then get deported back home from there. But this isn't going to solve the problem. It's not going to create any deterrent. The deterrent comes from knowing that you arrive on British soil, if you manage to get here in the first place, you're detained immediately and you're removed within hours and days, not weeks and months. That was the premise of the Rwanda plan. He scrapped that, and as a result, numbers have soared back up again. And we've got some of the highest grant rates of any European country right now.
And not necessarily just for asylum.
Hardly anyone does fail
People are
in their
given
asylum
indefinite
application.
leave. They're not granted asylum, but they're given indefinite leave to remain, aren't they? We're actually way higher than countries like Germany.
Yeah, exactly.
Often people have actually applied and failed in another country before they come here.
That's right. And people...
Why is that?
Well, people keep asylum shopping until they eventually come to the UK as a sort of final port of destination, and then they often spuriously claim that they're from countries like Afghanistan, Eritrea, where we have an almost 100% grant rate. And so, surprise, surprise, they never leave the UK. So his plan, even if you managed to find a country that was willing to work with him, is not going to work. Okay. You need to have a proper deterrent. That was Rwanda.
Well, it wasn't. It was only involving a few hundred people. That's not a proper deterrent. It's not what Australia did, is it?
Well, it was the beginning. As you know, I ultimately resigned because I wanted to strengthen the Rwanda deal. Right. I wanted to scrap the human rights law so we could send everyone out there immediately. Before
we go on to your brief in opposition, there's also a poll out today suggesting that a huge 46% of the population, when it comes to legal migration, people actually granted visas, and we've seen the explosion. I think next Thursday, we're going to be getting the latest figures on what 2024 did actually bring for us. They're nearly always an underestimate, the earlier figures, but we had, I think it was 728,000 net migrants, so people more arriving than leaving the country. Before that, it was over 900,000, but 46% of the population apparently would approve of a net zero migration policy, one in, one out, or fewer people being allowed in than leave the country. This is certainly the policy of Reform UK. You've been making lots of talk about, well, we should, do what we can, whatever is necessary to make sure that people aren't basically cancelling each other out, Reform voters and Tory voters at the next election. Would you support a one in, one out net zero migration policy?
Well, I've said for a very long time that we need to bring migration right down.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean anything.
Well, let me finish the point. To as close to zero as possible, because I think the country just needs...
What is as close to zero as possible?
Well, I'm not the Shadow Home...
Is it tens of thousands?
I'm not the Shadow Home Secretary.
Well, you know Chris Philp. You must talk to him occasionally.
It's not for me to set the policy, but I've been very clear that the country needs breathing space right now. We've been through an age of mass migration that was born by Tony Blair and continued under successive governments. It was catastrophic.
It got bigger under the Tories by a huge
Julia,
margin.
I'm the person who has been the most painfully honest about this. I ultimately resigned over our immigration policy. Catastrophic mistakes were made. It's put immense pressure on housing, public services. It's undercut British workers' wages. It's ultimately made us a much more disunited country where integration has proved to be impossible because of the numbers coming in. Let's bring it right down. Let's give the country a period of breathing space. I think that is what the poll that's come out today shows. Okay. And I've advocated for a very long time that the way you do this is by having a cap set by Parliament, that it's the law of the land, a democratic lock, so that for once politicians will know that the public will know that politicians are actually telling the truth. They're sick of the lies that you've had. Okay. And you saw more of that from Keir Starmer this week. Just another politician standing up, promising something on immigration when he knows it is not going to happen. His own Home Office says it's only going to lead to a reduction of 50, maybe 100,000 max a year. You're still going to have massive amounts of immigration for years to come. OK, let's go to something that is very much within your brief. You're the Shadow Justice Secretary. Yesterday, the woman you Shadow Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, announced that prisons are once again at breaking point, which we all knew would happen. We had those early releases last September. In October, very soon after they came into power as a Labour government. She's announced that more criminals are going to be freed early to free up space. That's including domestic abusers and sexual offenders, and also announced that those who do actually breach the terms of their release, and an awful lot more people do that than certainly used to, will only face 28 days back behind bars, whether they commit a further offence or not. We've had the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, we've had the Victims' Rights Commissioner, and others saying lives are going to be put in danger by these emergency measures. Is she right to do this, or does she have no other choice? Look, politics is about choices. And the Justice Secretary could have chosen to focus on the 10,500 foreign criminals who are in our prisons and deport them from this country. She could have focused on the fact there are 17,000 people in prison awaiting trial because the courts aren't sitting round the clock. She didn't choose to do either of those two things. Instead, she's releasing criminals early who have either reoffended or breached the terms of their early release, their licence. That is going to put the public in danger. And we've already seen in the past the consequences of her early release schemes. The last time she did this, somebody was killed the very same day that a criminal was released from prison. We even had prisoners joking as they came out of prison that they were going to be back behind bars. Yeah, they were popping champagne corks, being picked up by Rolls Royces, saying they were going to vote Labour because Keir Starmer had let them out. But you know as well as I do that if you were still in power last September, October, when these releases happened last time round, you'd have been doing exactly the same thing. Well, when we were in government, we had Cobra meetings every couple of days. Well done. That must have made a difference. Well, it did actually, Julia, because we didn't do an early release scheme like Labour have done. The then Justice Secretary, the Prime Minister, ministers were meeting every day, working round the clock to try and find every possible answer other than releasing dangerous criminals onto our streets, because we were absolutely damned if we were going to do that. Wasn't there another solution? Labour have ended up doing this. OK, phone in everybody. Can anyone think of what we should do? Well, we put more prisoners behind bars. We've got more crimes. We've got people serving longer sentences. Policy brought in by the Tories, quite rightly, I believe. And we've got running out of space. Is there a solution? Can anyone call in on 0344 499 1000 and help a Conservative politician about what might have been done in those 14 years to deal with that? Oh, build more prisons? Well, we should have built more prisons, absolutely. I want Julia to build more prisons. I think we should be sending more people to jail and for longer. The last Conservative government didn't build enough prisons. No government, frankly, in my lifetime has built enough prisons. So we need to do that. We're often told we put too many people behind bars, though. I want to put more people into prison because I want to get these people off the streets as a matter of public protection as well as punishment. You know, the Labour Party have an ideological aversion to this. They think that we should be letting these people out, that we shouldn't have them in jail. I think we need to control these people in prison to keep the public safe. If you look at the stats today, 9% of criminals are causing almost 60% of all the crimes in our country. So we need to get those people off our streets and into prison. And yes, you're absolutely right, that does require us to build more prisons. Is it also the kind of prisons? Because we know some of the countries, like Nordic countries, they actually spend a lot more on their individual prisons, but they do a lot more as well. They don't have prisoners sitting 23 hours a day in their cells off their heads on skunk watching television. They have people actually learning. We've got a lot of people, and getting skills and being rehabilitated. Huge number of people behind bars. And again, I don't think this should be used as an excuse for people, but nevertheless, huge number of people behind bars are coming from broken
broken homes. I mean, I don't mean mum and dad aren't together. I mean totally broken homes, neglected, abused. They've gone into care. They've got mental health problems. They've got drug or drink addiction problems. They've lived in a world where the crime is what they do. Everyone they know is committing crime. You put those people in prison for 6 months. You take them out again. What on earth do you think they're going to do afterwards?
Yeah, well, today our prisons are both very expensive and very ineffective. So it's costing about £700,000 to build a single prison cell, and it's costing about 50 grand a year to maintain a prisoner inside. And yet, as you say, prison rehabilitation is poor. About 80% of offenders will go on to reoffend. Education in prisons is poor. There's few opportunities for apprenticeships and gaining the vital skills that you need to build a life when you leave. And as you've seen in recent weeks, much more worryingly than that, our prisons are riddled with serious violence. Yeah. So that our prison officers, who are brave people doing a tough job, often for not very much money, are going to work genuinely fearful about their own personal safety.
What's the solution to that?
Well, I think governors need to stop appeasing prisoners, particularly the most dangerous offenders and terrorists. I mean, I think it's ludicrous that prisoners have had access to kettles, for example, to boil water, when we know that they've been used time and again to attack prison officers. I asked the government just last week, will they take these kettles off prisons? That doesn't cost money.
Particularly to terrorists they've been using them.
Particularly to terrorists, they haven't agreed to do that yet. I want prison officers to be given stab-proof vests, but of course it shouldn't have come to that, should it? You need to have governors stop appeasing prisons, particularly terrorists and Islamist terrorists within our jails, and get control of the prisons once again.
OK, the conversations about sentencing and early release relate to men's prisons at 99% capacity. But let's talk about women's prisons. Should Lucy Connolly, the wife of now a former Tory councillor, a childminder who wrote a horrific, unpleasant, very nasty tweet on the day of the Southport stabbings about, set fire to all the hostels, I mean, various rude words I can't say on air. She's got an appeal coming out against her 31-month sentence after she pleaded guilty to inciting racial hatred or back in August last year. There's a technicality on this appeal. It involves whether or not the right charge was brought and whether the sentence was appropriate. But when you have people who have committed numerous crimes, shoplifted hundreds of times, only been caught for a certain number of them, but committed numerous crimes, we've got domestic abusers, we've got violent criminals, we've had people involved in grooming gangs who have been given sentences lower than 31 months. What is a first-time offender woman, mother, carer to her family, a childminder, for writing something as unpleasant as it was? What is she doing behind bars for 31 months?
Well, I think you're right. It offends a basic sense of fairness within the criminal justice system. Look, it's a matter before the court now, so I can't comment on that specifically. She herself deleted the tweet because she decided it was wrong, and I certainly don't condone the comments that she made. But is it right that somebody goes to prison for that period of time for a tweet when you've got dangerous people being released early under the government's policy this week? And there are so many cases of people who've committed crimes so much more serious than this who are not going to jail. And I'll give you an example. This week, a man avoided jail despite it being found that he had 12,000 images of children on his computer, pornographic images, one or more of children as young as 1 year old being raped. And the man doesn't go to jail for that. And yet here you've got Lucy Connolly going to jail for a long period of time, as you say, somebody of previous good character, for a tweet. I think that offends most people's sense of fairness.
But how is that happening? Why are judges making such terrible decisions in those cases? I mean, look, I'm just thinking, I was going to move on, I want to talk about BBC with you. Hugh Edwards. The man who, he was the man who was the voice of of our lives on television. The Queen's funeral, the coronations, you name it, the elections, and he was sent images from a paedophile of babies being raped, for God's sake, and not a day behind bars.
Yeah, look, I think people are right to question whether judges are applying the rules correctly.
But we can't do anything about it because they're unelected and unaccountable.
Well, I think we have to hold them to account. Any public servant should be held to account, and I've been doing that. I mean, I'll give you an example.
You have to be fair.
I've raised some of the grooming gang sentences, and I applied to the Attorney General, who ultimately had some of the recent sentences that were handed down in Bradford, brought before the court, and this week they were increased. But they're still pitifully low. These were men who had queued up to rape a 13-year-old child, having plied her with heroin, and initially they were given a sentence as low as 6.5 years for that. Now increased to 10 years, but something is going wrong in our system that firstly judges made that mistake in the first place in sentencing so poorly.
I'd say the 10 years
but then 10 years
enough.
is nothing. It doesn't even come close to what the public would expect. No one serves their full sentence. It doesn't even come close to what people would expect.
If you became Justice Secretary, can I ask, could the first thing your job be that when someone is sentenced to 10 years or 4 years or 1 year or whatever, that they serve the actual length of time they've been sentenced? And yes, there's good behaviour, that's fine. That should be a given. If there is any bad behaviour, attacks on fellow prisoners, attacks on staff, drug dealing, whatever, you serve more time. Do we not have to get back to the basics that when a family, when a victim are told that this is the sentence that someone serves, that is the sentence they are actually behind bars for?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I've met victim after victim.
We've got that on record, everybody.
Who think the system is completely broken because you're told one thing and then something completely different happens. We're now at a point where people are serving maybe 40% of their sentence as a result of the government's early release scheme. Now, as a result of what we've learnt in the last 24 hours, if you're sent out, on licence back into the community, even if you reoffend or you breach your licensing conditions, you're only going to go to prison for 28 days and then you're automatically let out again. What is the deterrent in that? I mean, no deterrent whatsoever. People are losing faith in our criminal justice system right now.
I think they've rather lost it already. Just talk about faith in the BBC. We had Tim Davie, the BBC Director General, yesterday talking about how God bless him for thinking this, that there is a crisis of trust in society, but the BBC has a role in helping to tackle Britain's crisis of trust. I think a lot of people feel that the BBC has been part of that collapse in trust. I'd say particularly also over their coverage of the Israeli-Gaza war, and I think some of their coverage is certainly in the last few days in particular, absolutely shocking in terms of their willingness to take everything that Hamas says as gospel truth. And Nick Robinson on Radio 4 the other day accusing the Israeli government representative of propaganda only. We've also had Gary Lineker, the Match of the Day presenter. He's outgoing, of course, in the next year or so, but over a huge number of political comments he's made over the years. Extraordinarily this week, he tweeted out or retweeted something from a pro-Palestinian group which had a blatant anti-Semitic trope in it. It had a rat emoji. He was told it was clearly anti-Semitic. He deleted it. He's now issued a full apology. But he has said, crucially in an interview with The Telegraph, that if you are silent on Gaza, then you are complicit in the deaths. What do you say to him?
Well, I thought his comments were disgusting, and many other people would have lost their careers over this, whilst the BBC consider it enough to issue an apology, albeit a fulsome one, afterwards. I think the BBC have got very serious questions to answer. I shortly after October 7th, raised directly with Tim Davie the fact that back then they weren't even calling Hamas a terrorist organisation, and they had to be pushed kicking and screaming to even acknowledge that. But also, it's broader than just that with the BBC. It's their priorities. When do you hear them talking about the issues that most people in this country actually care about? Certainly an issue like immigration barely is covered by the BBC, and not in a way which speaks the language of normal people in this country.
The sentencing stuff from yesterday, you could barely find it on the BBC website today.
Yeah, no, they have an obsession with some issues, whether it's net zero,
trans,
Gaza, and they barely talk about the priorities of most people in this country, and that's why many of these programmes are losing so many viewers.
OK, great. Just finally, interesting, Keir Starmer is in Albania. He's asked by a journalist whether he would be fighting, his plans were for the future, whether he would be fighting the next election. He replied, interestingly, "You're getting way ahead of me." Do you think he's not going to fight the next election? Well,
I've no idea, but I don't think he's going to win the next election at this rate, because he's managed to become one of the most unpopular men in Britain.
Who is going to win?
I want Kemi Badenoch in the Conservative Party.
I didn't ask you who you want. I said who is going to win.
Well, the Conservative Party is going to win, but we've obviously got a massive mountain to climb, haven't we? Because we lost a huge amount of public trust and confidence, and I'm the first person to acknowledge that. But we've got to win that back by being honest about the mistakes we made.
If you have to do a deal with Nigel Farage Reform to do that, to oust Labour, would you do it?
I want to put Reform out of business. I want to send Nigel back to retirement.
If you can't put Reform out of business, which doesn't look likely right now, given they're ahead of you by quite a long way in the polls, would you do a deal?
No, look, Kemi's been very clear. No pacts, no coalitions.
Are you very clear?
Yeah, I've said for a very long time that my objective is to bring back, over time, the millions of voters that we lost at the last election.
Robert Jenrick, always great to have you in the studio. Thank you very much, Conservative, of course, Shadow Justice Secretary. We get your thoughts on that.